Welcome to the Faith Focused Free Thinking Podcast, a ministry of Ozaukee Congregational Church in Grafton, Wisconsin. This is our 6th episode, and we're glad you're with us. Hello, I'm Jeff Larson. Welcome back to the Faith Focused Free Thinking Podcast, where we believe faith is important. But we're also okay to ask the difficult questions. We think it's important that we think. We're trying to make sense out of the world and out of the human condition and give ourselves hope and peace and joy in the face of it. Up to this point, I think what we've been doing largely is asking some questions that I've wanted to ask about some of the things I learned growing up in the tradition that I was a part of, or some of the underlying assumptions that were part of that tradition. And I want to do the same thing today. I want to ask another question that was part of the tradition I grew up in. But first, I just want to say again that even though I'm asking some of these questions, I'm so thankful for the tradition that I grew up in. As many of you know, I grew up in a sort of a conservative evangelical tradition, and I experienced the very best out of that tradition. I mean, from the love of my parents to the churches I attended to the people that were around me, I just experienced the very best out of that tradition, and I'm so thankful for it. Just the love of God was represented to me so well, and I know it's not true of everybody within that tradition, but it's not true of everybody within any tradition. Every tradition has people that represent things very well and in a way that's loving. And every tradition has people that don't represent it very well or in a way that's not loving. And so I'm just so grateful for the tradition I was raised in, even though I'm asking some of these questions and want to think about these things. I think that's important. But whatever tradition you're a part of, if it's working for you and it is giving you hope and joy and peace and a way to navigate life that's positive, hey, that's great. That's great. So the question I want to ask today, if I can phrase it as a question, is this: is Jesus the only way to God? That's a question that we asked growing up, or maybe a statement we made: Jesus is the only way to God. But to phrase it as a question, the answer to that question was a resounding yes. Jesus is the only way to get to God. And of course, our scriptural support for that was John 14:6, where Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Or Acts chapter 4, verse 12, where Peter is talking to the religious leaders, and he says, "Salvation is found in no one else. There is no other name given among men by which we must be saved." That Jesus is the only way we get to God. And I think what that made me feel like, or what that did for us in the tradition that we were a part of, is sort of made me feel like our tradition was right and other traditions were wrong, or Christianity was the only true way to God and everybody else was believing a lie, or everybody else was believing falsehood. And I guess I just never really thought, well, could we look at that in a different way? Or is there a different answer to that question? Or could we think about the question in a different way? And I want to try and do that today. But I think for us, answering that question, yes, Jesus is the only way to God, what that meant to us was, what we meant by get to God was to be right with God such that when you die, you go to be with God in a place of bliss and paradise. And of course, if you're not right with God, well, when you die, you go to be separated from God in a place of torment and misery. And the only way that you are right with God is through what Jesus has done for you, through the historical life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That's the only mechanism through which God redeems the world or makes people right with himself. And the way that you appropriate what Jesus has done for you to yourself is you put your faith in Jesus, or you trust in Jesus, or you receive what Jesus has done for you, or you accept Jesus as your Savior. These are all phrases that we used. So the only way to get to God is through Jesus. And again, what that made me feel like was, well, we've got it right and other people have it wrong. And I never really thought, could we look at it differently? And I guess today now, if you ask me that question today, I think I would hesitate to answer with a yes or no. Because I guess, first of all, I would want to say, well, there are lots of ways that people approach God or approach the idea of God. Of course, there are a lot of different religions out there. There are a lot of different traditions within those religions. And everybody's trying to make sense out of the world, and everybody's trying to understand the idea of God. And it seems like in large measure, although there are differences, of course, between religions and all of that, that those traditions seem to produce the same result, if I can say it that way. That in large measure, religious experience is common. So what we experience in a relationship with God in the Christian tradition, whether that's the hope, peace, and joy we experience, or worship with God, or maybe something that we assume to be an answer to prayer, other people in other religious traditions also experience. Right? Hope and joy and peace, or the worship of God, or things that they consider to be an answer to prayer, or maybe they credit these things to karma or something else. But largely speaking, religious experience is common. And so in that sense, well, no, Jesus is not the only way to get to God. People understand God in different ways and seem to experience the same things in the process. Now, within, of course, the tradition I grew up in, we would say, okay, well, yeah, great. People experience God in a variety of ways, or approach God in a variety of ways. But what is it that is actually going to get us to God? I mean, when we die, or what is it that's actually going to bring us to paradise, or what is the mechanism through which we get to God? And I guess I would say, well, here is what Jesus represents to me. That if there is to be salvation, or if there is to be that which transcends this world, something beyond this world, if there is to be redemption for the suffering of people throughout history, it's going to have to come from something greater than ourselves. It's going to have to come from God. It's going to have to be something God does for us, or something God gives to us. I mean, all the advances that we have made as humanity over the centuries, we still deal with human nature, and we still deal with our mortality, and we're still trying to make sense out of life and give meaning that transcends this world. And it seems obvious to me that if there is to be that, it has to come from God to us. It has to be something that God does for us. And this is what Jesus represents to me. That God put himself in our shoes, sacrificed himself on our behalf, has done for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. That the path between us and God doesn't run from us to God, rather it runs from God to us. And so in that way, you could say, yes, Jesus is the only way to God. But in my mind, that doesn't mean that, well, you have to follow this particular path, or you have to believe this particular thing, or you have to get this particular thing right, or only one tradition is going to get you there, so to speak. No, God has come to all of us in the person of Christ. At least that's what Jesus represents to me. God has done it for us. Now, I am less concerned with the particular mechanism of that, the particular way in which God comes to us. I mean, that is, if the particular mechanism by which God redeems us or saves us or brings redemption for the world or whatever is the historical life and death and resurrection of Jesus, hey, that's great. And for me, I think it's helpful that the person and story of Jesus is rooted in history. But I'm less concerned with that being the particular mechanism as much as I am convinced that salvation or redemption comes from God to us because of the unconditional love of God for us. Because, as we've talked about before, if the historical life and death and resurrection of Jesus is the particular mechanism through which God saves the world or brings redemption, and if the only way for us to appropriate it to ourselves is to put our faith in it, well, then I think God has not done near enough to give us evidence for it and has not made that evidence near enough accessible or available to people in the chaos of life. I trust in the unconditional love of God for all of us. I trust that God has done for all of us that which we couldn't do for ourselves. And that's what Jesus represents to me. But I'm less concerned that, that's the particular mechanism and that people have to put their faith in that mechanism. And so I think, hey, whatever tradition people are a part of, whatever religion they're a part of, what I'm most concerned about or what I most want is that people would live with hope and joy and peace and a love for themselves and a love for others. And I sort of have in my mind a little speech that I would want to give to people if we're talking about religion or perspectives on God, or the person who comes to my door, wanting to share with me a message. I want to say, hey, thanks so much for sharing this with me. And hey, all of us are doing our best to understand God. And, if what you believe about God and the tradition that you're a part of and the way that you make sense of the world, if that's working for you and it's giving you hope and joy and peace and it's enabling you to love yourself and love others, that is great. That is great. But if you ever get to a point where you feel like that the way you understand God and the world or the tradition you're a part of or whatever is only adding pressure to your life and is not bringing you peace or freedom, then I want you to know I think there's another way to look at it. I find hope and peace, a love for myself, peace and freedom in the embrace of the unconditional love of God that I see represented in the person and story of Jesus. And maybe you could find hope and peace and joy there too. I feel like I want to say that to the people in the tradition that I grew up in, which is a Christian tradition, embracing the message of the gospel, the person and story of Christ. I want to say, if the way that you understand it and the things you have to do and the things you have to believe, if it's working for you, great. But if you get to the point where you feel like this is just adding pressure to my life, I think there's another way to look at it. Jesus is the only way to God, not because you have to get to God through him, but because God has gotten to you. And what that has done for me is it's freed me from needing to get other people to believe the same thing I do, or to look at things in the same way I do, or to have the faith I think they need to have. It's given me a freedom to show a genuine interest in people and to learn from them. And maybe we learn together. Because what we trust is that salvation is not on our shoulders. Getting to God is not something we have to do. It is something God has done for us. So that's the way I think about that question. Is Jesus the only way to God? No, people experience God in a number of different ways. But what Jesus represents to me is God has done it for us. And I find great hope in that. So that's episode 6. I hope that's helpful for you in some ways. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to think through these things. And I'd love to hear what you think. Don't hesitate to shoot me a note, jeff@occhurch.org. I hope you're having a great 2024, and we'll see you next month. Thanks so much for joining us.